Thank you and welcome to our opening panel. And I'm hoping that we can use this time to go from our theoretical discussion about the role of business into some practical examples and actually help to challenge the people who are watching to maybe do more and make the words of the agreement come alive. And it's a time when this could not be more important because as the United Nations opens that 75th anniversary, we're really in truly uncharted waters. In my entire lifetime, we look to the UN as and these multilateral organizations to create international cooperation, to create joint activities for a better world. And it seems with all the things we're facing in the world right now, we have the potential of going in the opposite direction. And so it's even more imperative to have this discussion right now and figure out what we can do, especially as a private sector, to address these big challenges across the globe in a more systemic and integrated way, because it truly will take all of us to do that. With the all the things that have already been mentioned on climate change, on the pandemic, on economic uncertainty, on racial tensions, and on making this truly a more just society where all of the benefits of the Sustainable Development Goals and the vision for the future can come alive. So given the challenging environment that we're in, we're going to focus a little bit on Sustainable Development Goal number 16 and its aspiration to promote peaceful and inclusive societies, and really the structure that helps us to obtain and have some certainty in life around governance of the rule of law and the benefits of living in societies that abide by rule of law. And it's reassuring to know that over 1,000 companies have signed on to the agreement, and we were very proud to do that as a company ourselves. But, you know, what do the words mean, and what actions can come from these words? So I'd like to use that to turn to the panelists and get started, because I want us to focus on how we can take these aspirations and convert them into real action that will help move us toward a much better world. And but as we do, one thing I did want to just give us a moment to pause on. It's hard to have a discussion about the rule of law and fairness and equality without acknowledging the painful passing this weekend of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I just think that we all should acknowledge her contribution, particularly in the U.S. where I live, but really for people everywhere, and especially for women. And so I hope that we just take a moment to reflect on that. So in turning to this, the first question, well, first I want to introduce our panel. So we have with us three great panelists. We have Alan Murray, who is the Chief Executive Officer at Fortune magazine. We have Leanne Gale, who's the Chief Legal Officer and Executive Committee member at Nestle Corporation. And we have Kevin Kuhn, an international human rights lawyer and former chair of the Global Policy Committee at Baker McKenzie, a huge global law firm. And so we'll be able to use the blended perspectives of our three guests. And I thank you all for participating in this. And Alan, I'm going to pick on you first. I'm going to turn to you first to give us an overview. Alan, I know that for the past few years, your passion at Fortune has been to create CEO initiatives that take people from words to action. And what have you kind of learned from this? What is it about some leaders versus other leaders that give people courage? And what kind of perspective can you give us? And just I want to acknowledge also that I noted that Fortune this morning released the list of the most of the companies changing the world. And I think that's what we're really talking about here, are companies that have the courage to change the world. And I think sometimes business is seen as more passive. So I'm very anxious to have you give us an overview.
Thank you, Marjorie, for that generous introduction, and thanks to the UN Global Compact for this effort. Let me take a step back and put in a little perspective, because I really come at this, although I am now a CEO, I come at this as a lifelong journalist. It was 50 years ago that Milton Friedman wrote the now famous story in a column in the New York Times saying the social responsibility of business is to make a profit. And that reflected the kind of market-centered view that if we all pursue our self-interest, the market will take care of society's need. The free hand, will make sure that we end up in a better place. And obviously there was merit to that. I mean, if you look at what happened as market fundamentalism rose in the 80s and 90s, we saw around the world the largest alleviation of poverty in the history of the world. But then came the Great Recession 12 years ago, which was fundamentally a market failure. People like to ask, why aren't more bankers in prison because of what happened then? And I've always thought the answer to that is because most of the bankers didn't break any laws. It was a market failure, a fundamental market failure, and it caused people to start questioning this market fundamentalism that Milton Friedman had expressed decades before. And there was a famous speech that Bill Gates gave at Davos 12 years ago talking about creative capitalism. Michael Porter started talking about shared value capitalism. You had inclusive capitalism, compassionate capitalism. Everybody suddenly felt a need to put an adjective in front of capitalism. And so throughout the last decade, there's been this growing recognition among business leaders, I think really of two things. First of all, that capitalism could be done better. It's a powerful system, but it could be done better. And that governments weren't necessarily, in many parts of the Western world, doing a very good job of dealing with social problems. And so that's what's really led to this gradual rise over the course of a decade of business leaders who fundamentally feel like they need to spend more time focusing on the social footprint of their business, the rise of purpose. And in some ways, the Business Roundtable statement last August reflected a tipping point. I would say the COVID crisis, when it started in March, I thought my initial reaction was, oh no, we're going into another recession. Everyone's going to retrench, focus on the bottom line, lose focus on these broader social goals. In fact, the exact opposite happened. I think that's the nature of the crisis. It was a stakeholder crisis. It forced businesses to pay more attention to that. So you now see more and more businesses. I wouldn't necessarily say a majority of businesses, but certainly many more than 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago that feel it's important for them to do more than maximize profits, but also maximize their positive social impact. And Marjorie, I'll just say one other thing that I think is driving this. As you well know, the importance of human capital in business has steadily risen over the course of my career as a journalist. Financial resources, physical resources are no longer as important as they were in a world where technology rules, and human capital, intellectual property, intangibles become more and more important. And what business leaders are discovering is that the best talent doesn't want to just work to make money. They want to feel like they're making a contribution to the world. And so having a strong purpose at the center of your business that goes beyond making a profit is fundamental to getting the best talent and ultimately fundamental to succeeding. And so we've seen increasing evidence over the course of the decade that focusing on purpose and making profit are not at odds. They sit hand in hand and they work together. And that's a big part of why we're seeing what is, in a way, a kind of renaissance in the way business operates today.
So thank you, Alan. I hope we can come back in a little bit to talk about how you're converting words into action. Sure. So we'll hold that thought. Because right now, I'd like to ask Leanne, take us inside a big company like Nestle and this whole question of how you decide what is your social purpose and how that works against or with your business principles. so that we have a better sense of how a company can lead with courage.
Yes, thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be part of this forum. Yes, I working for a company like Nestle has a long history of creating shared values. And that's focused and based on running our business with purpose. Respect being one of our closely held values and the one that we base all our decisions upon. Fairness, inclusion as well provide a great basis upon which to then create shared value, not only, as we heard previously, for our profit for our shareholders, but also to impact positively the people we work with, our supply chain, the communities where we operate. So I think that we have a tremendous opportunity as a company like Nestle, and it's always been one of my personal motivators to be able to create value for shareholders, but as well as make a difference, a positive difference to the communities where we operate. If I could give a concrete example of something that Nestle does to change that environment around us for the better. We have been working for the last couple of years in a smaller country with a high risk of corruption. And we wanted to make a difference on the ground, not only for ourselves, but other businesses, whether in our industry or elsewhere, and the communities in which we operate. So we set up an initiative called Leading Business with Integrity. And there's a two-prong approach to that. One is we've brought small and medium enterprises together under sponsorship of large companies like ourselves to put in place an anti-bribery program based on the Transparency International standards. Second, we've been training mentors, train the trainer type of approach to help coach small and medium enterprises on how best to tackle bribery. This interrelation with small and medium enterprises, large enterprises across industry with key local stakeholders is one way in which we try to not only accept the environment that we find ourselves, the business environment, but positively change it for the benefit of the community.
Thank you. I think this leads into another aspect of this, and I'm going to come to Kevin, not only to comment on this, but maybe to make this transition, because we heard, you heard about this statement that we've all signed. But one common thread in that statement that people saw was that business and societies can't thrive without peace, justice, and strong institutions. And that's really the centerpiece of Goal 16, and also really reflective of the G and ESG. And I wondered if you could comment about not only how important that is, especially with your particular background. But, I was musing when we had this advanced discussion about maybe it's about ESG. Maybe it's about that justice is all about equity and fairness and all the things we're talking about. And have we made governance broad enough to answer the calling that we all are speaking to today? So, Kevin.
Thank you, Marjorie, and Alan and Leanne. A pleasure to be with you this morning. Let me just approach this in terms of from the perspective of a global law firm, which is in 44 countries around the world, somewhat uniquely positioned to deal with with regards to the justice system, whether we're interacting with it around the globe or we're advising our clients on a host of issues, not just legal issues. And it reflects somewhat the evolution, not just of business, but also of the business advisors. So as risk advisors, we're now advising clients on legal risk, as you would expect from a law firm, but also on other risks, such as commercial risk, brand, reputational risk, and a host of other issues. And so it requires a broader perspective, and then to deal with questions around governance. And so, the question of governance, as Alan pointed out, so as he quoted Milton Friedman from 50 years ago, social responsibility of business, but that term has the common parlance now is around the social contract of the actors, the business actors, and what does that mean? And governance, and from a risk perspective, not simply about making profit, but also about the social contract of profit is not contrary to the social purpose. And in fact, they're not mutually exclusive. And there's a lot of great examples, and many companies, quite frankly, are dealing with those issues from a governance perspective. I think about the example of one of the companies which has 10 years ago embedded the whole question about sustainable commodities at the core of their business. And so if you reverse the analogy, it is, if they have a sustainable business, will lead to profit. And many companies have been leading the way on this. And so this entire question around governance and the G in ESG is business must play a critical role in that. They're doing so in their own organizations. And I think about Nestle, for example. Leanne gave an example, but I can tell you from working with them for the last few years as a patron sponsor of SDG 16, they are quietly working away on key issues around governance and peace and justice without much fanfare, quite frankly. And many businesses around the globe are doing that and showing leadership on that. And so they're engaged, they're bringing their expertise as to what it is that they can contribute or add to the governance piece in terms of cooperation.
I'd like to invite the other panelists to comment on this, maybe this concept of justice, but Alan, in particular, this morning when you released this list of companies changing the world, what was the determining factor, not just on Fortune's judgment, but what makes a good company really great in terms of their commitment to society and their ability to lead, the kind of things we're hearing about Nestle today?
Yeah, thank you, Marjorie. The Change the World list was started by Fortune 5 years ago. Editor-in-Chief Cliff Leaf and I looked at what we were doing and realized we had lots of lists. The classic, of course, is the Fortune 500 list that measures companies by size. But we had lists that measured companies by how fast they grow, by how much their employees like them, by whether they're admired by their colleagues. And he and I both felt strongly that in this changing environment, we needed to look at companies that were trying to address social problems at scale using their profit-making superpowers. And so that was the inception of the Change the World list. And as you know, Marjorie, that's evolved at Fortune into a community of CEOs. And the CEO of Nestle is a member of that community, the Fortune CEO Initiative, that is aimed at sharing ideas and best practices on how you maximize your social footprint and have a positive impact on society at the same time you are doing well by your shareholders. So the Change the World list is a list of a little over 50 companies that have done that. We're not trying to tell the world that these are good companies versus bad companies. We just mean to show that that businesses have incredible power to address the kinds of problems that are meant to be addressed by the SDGs. And that many of them, Nestle included, are actually doing that consciously. And so we want to highlight some of those examples. And one of the things we found, this is the 6th version of the list, is that over time, it's gotten easier and easier to find companies doing it. It is definitely a movement on the rise. I would credit Nestle for being an early mover and paving the way for others, but you do see more and more companies moving in this direction.
So Leanne, maybe we can take that one step further. Since you sit on the executive committee and you're privy to all these discussions, you know, I've always believed that the business case is easy, that you can't have a successful company in a failed world. So if you don't pay attention to what's outside your company, you'll have no customers, no supply chain, no one. And but I know that for some companies, it's been a real journey to understand the business case. And so I wondered if you could maybe give us insight for the people that are listening today, and maybe their companies aren't as far along, is what do you say to make sure that you're taking into account all the social impact as well as the financial impact?
Yes, well, it starts at home, of course, making sure that we are running our company and leading with respect and fairness and inclusion, as I mentioned earlier, and then looking how we want to be present in the local community in which we want to operate. And that's not always an easy approach, depending on the circumstances. So, we operate in almost 190 countries around the world, and the environment in which we operate in many cases is very difficult. But we've taken decisions based on who we want to be, our purpose to provide, nutritional and high quality food and beverages to communities around the world, as whether or not we are willing to go the tough road to remain a strong member of a community. If I can give you another example, there's another country which is quite high on physical violence, and we have a factory in a location that has seen quite an extraordinary number of murders over the course of the last many years. Now, the easier answer might have been just to close up the shop and move that factory to a lower risk jurisdiction or country. But we didn't want to do that. We wanted to remain and be viable and make a difference in the country. So we started working with local governments and civil society organizations to establish programs to help and get at the root causes of the violence. This particular program, and it's quite new, so we're still working to see whether it can be replicated and scaled up beyond the community. But the first element of it is called an observatory. So it's an observatory for causes of violence, gathering data, working with the local mayors, working with law enforcement, working with family services to get to root causes and gather data on that. The second pillar is something we call conciliators in equity. This is, again, working with the local governments, working with the Ministry of Justice, working with local communities to provide an alternative forum for community members to resolve their conflicts other than going to court. And as part of that, we've been mentoring and training conciliators to act in that conciliation role, with the support of the Ministry of Justice so that the resolutions can have the force of law. And then the third pillar to support this is a youth leadership school, where we're teaching the youth in the local area about human rights, about advocacy, about political participation. As you can see, it's a broad spectrum of activities that go to the heart of how the community operates. And we just want to contribute to raise that bar and also work with governments and civil society to improve that governance, improve the strength of those institutions, and ultimately to provide a more peaceful, less violent environment, not only for our own staff, but for the community around us. I think that's a great example of companies, Nestle in this case, pushing the status quo, the boundaries, the paradigm. How, it doesn't have to be this way. How can we work with others to create a different paradigm? And I think that's really at the heart of making a difference and working collaboratively. And I really believe there's an opportunity with this tripartite of pandemic, climate change, and our recession to find that space to move those needles and those paradigms for the benefit of all of us.
Marjorie, can I?
Please, Alan, go ahead, and then I'll come back.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that because I really like your framing. It's hard to be a successful business in a failing world, but a lot of it really comes down to time frame. I was chief content officer in the final days of Time Inc. when the company was under attack by an activist. And if you're thinking in the short term, how do I get as much cash into the company in the next quarter? there's all sorts of bad you can do in the world. It's not hard for any of us to think of trade-offs, of things you would do to your product, to your systems that that will help you make money in the short term, but are bad for the company and bad for society in the long term. And what happens over time is that the interests of stakeholders and the interests of society and the interests of the company start to merge the longer your time horizon gets. And I think it's not a coincidence that companies like Nestle, Nestle has been around for over 150 years, right? That it's companies that are focusing on, hey, how do we make sure we're still here and functioning 100 years from now that are making the most progress on this front?
Yeah, and I was wondering, Kevin, from your point of view, I think of big law firms like Baker McKinsey as super spreaders in a good way, because you have such a reach for big companies around the world. You see so many different things, and you're in a position to advise companies to move in one direction versus another. And so I just wondered if you would also comment on what you've been hearing from Alan and Leanne about these choices companies make and how we encourage the collaboration that we need to really change the world and move the world forward, especially with this, coming out of the pandemic, and where I think there's an attitude of wanting to be more helpful.
Thank you, Marjorie. It's an interesting dilemma for law firms. Law firms as global advisors, they too need to re-examine their own model in terms of their purpose and how they're advising companies. So we have the advantage of working with many companies around the globe on issues of rule of law and advising around risk issues. But part of it, part of the theme that we've been examining as a law firm and as a business advisor is, what is our role? And the new lawyer role to advise about on these issues like ethical conduct, and not simply how does one conform to the law or be in compliance with the law, but around the broader issues that Leanne has identified and Alan have identified around what are the risks around social purpose, and then from a sustainability perspective in the longer term, and how does one want to operate. I wanted to pick up on a theme that Leanne touched on, which is around when we talk about stakeholders. And what you've also seen over the last number of years in particular is business expanding their view about who their stakeholders are and the importance of them, and sort of a more engagement with those communities on a broader basis to address the issues that they confront, and depending on where that is. And in poor governance zones where companies have to be more courageous as to how do they tackle these issues, rather than cut and run, but engage locally. And then I want to bring the role of the UN into this discussion as well, because part of this is the role of business, but it's also about the role of some of the other key stakeholders. And the UN being one of them, and the power that they have to work cooperatively with business. There's a recognition that the UN has come to. The UN Global Compact 10 years ago, when it was established, was at the forefront of recognizing how do they work in a way with business that the UN itself couldn't resolve all of the issues, and that recognition. The other agencies within the UN umbrella have been slower converts to that concept, but I think there's a general recognition, as evidenced by this session over the next 3 days, about the important role of business can play, has been playing, and must play. And Alan's example about highlighting best practices, there are, as he knows and we know on this panel, there are companies that have been doing this for many, many years, and highlighting those best practices is part of the key to share those successes. And there's still lots of work to do, but there's lots of work to do by all the stakeholders in terms of meeting the challenges and moving forward to address these issues, including how do we reach 2030 and make progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. And so it is a joint effort amongst all those stakeholders. And sort of a lack of suspicion that has, been present about, parties working together, with companies working with NGOs, and NGOs working with companies, and the UN working with companies and being co-opted in some sense. And so we're breaking down those barriers, and there's lots of great examples of it.
So I'm going to come back in a minute to the role of the UN and ask you all a little bit about what you think the UN could and should be doing, or how can we collaborate in a more effective way. So you can be thinking about that. But in the meantime, Kevin, following on what you just said, one of the important things I hope people get out of these next couple of days is the will to lead with more courage and to take more risk about the kinds of things Leanne was talking about, not cutting and running, but figuring out what the engagement strategy is for maybe even unlikely stakeholders. Because at the end of the day, it's those stakeholders that are going to help define who the company is and how they're viewed, and also what happens back in the society from what the company's actions are. So I wondered, and maybe this is a little bit of storytelling, but how can we encourage more companies to lead with courage? What can we do to convert this idea? I mean, if we got over 1,300 businesses to sign this statement of how important this is to society, and especially around Goal 16, to build trust, to have the right rules for society, to make sure we live in a just world. What else can we do to share or to make it easier or safer for companies to lead with courage? And I don't know who would like to start on that, but I don't know if you want to continue and what you.
Sure, I'll give an example, and I'll reflect on it from inside a global law firm. And law firms, frankly, aren't known as being innovative. Well, their structures.
Institutions.
As institutions, they have a traditional model, a very hierarchical, and so there's many things law firms can do in terms of showing courage, and in some respects, businesses doing it as well. And part of it's doing things differently than in the past. I'll give one example. We at Baker McKenzie did a deep dive over the last few years around our harassment policies, our governance structure, about how do you deal with harassment issues in the workplace. And it all had to start from the top in terms of leadership, both in terms of commitments, the words, but really we all know it's not about the words, it's really about the actions. And how do you, in a very hierarchical structure like a law firm, empower people, from the person that's working in the photocopy room to a senior partner, and empower them to come forward about issues that you talk about and you have policies around, whether it be anti-discrimination, gender equality, and the rest of it. And so it does take bold action. And I'll give a couple of examples. What we've tried to do, which is, we signed on to gender equality initiatives where 40-40-20 in terms of all of our leadership roles within the firm, recognizing that law firms historically have lacked gender equality or anything near it at the leadership level. And if anybody who knows a law firm will know that. And we signed on, as another example would be, we signed on to the UN Global Compact, the first global law firm to do so back in 2017. And so we've been trying to take some positive steps and lead by example. And I think that's really my point, which is lead by example. A recent example we've run a series of short internal videos of our people speaking candidly about their lived experiences of race and ethnicity, managing well-being, mental health, and social mobility. And one of the first people to do so and share his story was our new chair. Very empowering throughout the organization to hear our chair talk about the experiences that he has as somebody from Singapore living in Hong Kong and traveling the world in terms of his own issues. And so part of that really is about leadership from the top, and then empowering and creating safe spaces within your organization for people to address the underlying issues and concerns that they have. And so whether it be a law firm, a global corporation, or otherwise, that's really where we have to move to if we're going to have progress. And that requires courage in terms of challenging the status quo that we've all grown up in and has provided some comfort.
And Ellen, I know one of the things that I really admire about what you're doing is, naming and faming rather than naming and shaming, taking the positive approach and finding companies that are willing to lead by example. So, I'm sure you have a point of view.
And Marjorie, I completely agree with what Kevin says about the importance of leadership. These kinds of things do have to be driven from the top. But as you know, I spend a lot of my time talking to CEOs of large organizations. It's one of the privileges of my position. And whenever I hear these stories about companies like Nestle and the great things they're doing, I always ask why. Why are you doing this? What is motivating you to do this? And there are multiple reasons, but the number one reason that I hear over and over again is because my employees want me to. My employees want to be part of an organization that's doing good in the world. And I think if you want to think about how you promote this, the best way to do is encourage that, because that's where the real impetus for change is coming from, particularly millennial employees. I spent a couple of years running the Pew Research Center, and during that time, we did a big study on the attitudes of millennials. And one of the things we found that was kind of interesting was that the millennial generation has far fewer formal connections to society than previous generations. They're slower to get married. They're much likely to belong to organized religion. They don't join the Elks Club, the Moose Club, the Rotary Club, the Country Club, whatever it is. And as I looked at that data, I realized, wow, for this generation, the employer is their formal link to society. And so a lot of the expectations that previous generations, might have gone to work to make money and then go to your church or to your Rotary Club to do service, all of that is being placed in the company. And I think that's really a powerful force for change and something that needs to be encouraged if we want to make progress in this direction.
Yeah, I was glad to hear Kevin talk about the equity and the gender issue in particular, because of my own experiences over a lifetime of building a company in a world that was kind of dominated by people who didn't look like me. And Leanne, I wonder, in terms of your experience as well, in terms of equity and inclusion, what your experience has been, not just at Nestle, but what we do to encourage other companies to make sure that there's really a level playing field for people to advance. And this is a lot of what we're seeing in the U.S. now in terms of the systemic racism and what that has caused when there's no mechanisms to make sure that people have equal opportunity.
Yeah, I think a basic premise that underlies all of that is respect. So respect for another human being, regardless of their race, gender, experiences, how they talk, what they look like, etc. And if you can ground your policies and the way you make decisions in respect, I think that goes a long way to reaching that equality and equity that we want to see. The other piece is the inclusion. We talk a lot about diversity, but I'm sure many people on this forum have heard the expression, diversity is asking different people to the dance, but inclusion is asking them to dance. And I think it's that inclusion part that is where people get tripped up, is that they don't realize that the whole benefit of their diversity can only be had if they are inclusive. And I think from a business perspective, it's a no-brainer. More inclusive workforce provides better answers, better problem solving, a better overview of all the possibilities available because you have that diverse points of view and perspective brought to it. I worked did a lot of work on the ethics side as well, and I've worked for quite a few companies where safety was of primal importance, and that behavior of inclusion underlies all of that, whether it be operational excellence, making sure you're getting the best standard procedure, et cetera, that you can have for your operation, speaking up if you see something's not right in respect of a safety hazard, or from an integrity, diversity, equity perspective, speaking up. So inclusion, I think, is one of the most powerful tools and behaviors that we can encourage, support, really bring to the fore in businesses to achieve ultimately, an equitable, fair workforce where everyone feels respected.
So, the way I've always framed it is also that, that you can have a number, which is diversity, but inclusion is a way of life. It's something that has to come from the individual. And so, it makes it an interesting question because we're here talking about rules and a rule-based society, but there's certain cultural things or certain behaviors that you can't legislate. You have to create an environment where those things come from inside the person. And I agree, it starts at the top. And I think that's, for me, a big definition of courageous leadership is being able to set an example that others can follow. And I know at the end of this session, we're going to be talking a little bit about that with Doug Seidman. But in the meantime, I don't know if you have any other thoughts about that. And then I do want to turn to the role of the UN and maybe some thoughts we have that we can leave our guests with.
Marjorie, what I would, and this may sound odd coming from a lawyer, but what I just wanted to highlight what you pointed out, which I think underlies this entire discussion, which is it's around values and purpose. And rather than, what does the law say? I mean, the law is obviously an important element, but when we're talking about sustainable organizations, whether that be a business or a law firm or any type of organization, it's really about the values and the purpose. And so when Alan talks, or Leanne mentions about the other influences, whether it be the millennials, in terms of their view as to the organization they belong to or want to belong to, or whether it is having a sustainable supply chain so that if you're a commodities business like Nestle and you don't have a sustainable supply of cocoa, and you're working with your farmers in far-flung places to ensure that's sustainable, that goes to the core of your business. And so, when we talk about moving away from Milton Friedman, where profit is all, it is about, and that's the beauty of this term sustainable. And it means different things. It can mean different things to different organizations, but it means a broader consideration as to what is the value and purpose of the organization. Is it about having a secure commodity supply chain that goes to the core of the business? Is it about being able to attract the best and brightest talent to be innovative or otherwise? And so there is a fundamental shift. The roundtable statement last year was really a turning point that led a lot of organizations to look at, to re-examine what had been common folklore as to a profit is good. And, I reflect on that from a law firm's perspective in terms of what do we need to do as a law firm in shifting to align with the advice that we're giving to our clients on a global basis, providing the best advice, and so that we as a law firm understand those issues as well, and to be better aligned as to the advice that we're giving to our clients and understanding the environment. And so, purposeful leadership. Yep.
Yeah,
And I'll
sorry.
stop
That's
there.
why I
Go ahead.
raised before this whole question about ESG versus ESJ, because I didn't know if the world sees governance as a very finite and legalistic framework. And I think we really need to make sure that it's understood that this is much bigger than that. This is really what's driving kind of the rules of the game from not just what is legally there, but also what is required for a just society. So that's why I was throwing that out before. So I totally agree. Alan, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just building on that. For this to work, ultimately, you're going to need measurement and you're going to need accountability. We spent 100 years, more than 100 years, building up an elaborate framework to measure profit and return to owners and shareholders, right? We have a massive accounting industry whose job is to do that. And we don't have the same thing for these social goals that we've been talking about. I give the UN a lot of credit for staking out the goals, the SDGs. The next step is then to create an infrastructure that allows companies to transparently measure progress towards those goals and to be held accountable for their successes and failures. That's not going to happen overnight. There's some people, Marjorie, as you know, working on that. I think the big four accounting firms have done some good work in that area. A lot more needs to be done. But until you have those systems of measurement and accountability, it's going to be hard to make all this talk about stakeholder capitalism into a reality.
So we have about 7 minutes left, and I really wanted to make sure we had time to go back to, what Kevin was saying before, and that is, as we reflect on this 75th anniversary of the UN and this recent statement, what do you think the UN could or should do to enable responsible businesses to work with governments and civil society to bring this together under maybe with the strength of the UN behind it, and to make there be more expectation and opportunity? And I don't know, Leanne, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. I mean, one of the things that we're party to right now is the action platform for SDG 16. And I think the action platforms are a great way to bring the different stakeholders together on a certain given topic, businesses, CSOs, governments, et cetera, to share best practices, to work on initiatives, et cetera. And the UN, it provides a nice neutral opportunity and forum platform to do that. Picking up on the previous comment, I think the UN also can continue to provide hard data that can drive action and cooperation to really, hold up the mirror in terms of reality of what's going well and what's not going well, so that, we can look to get after actual impact on the ground in whatever area that we're focusing on. And then, of course, continuing to enable pathways for communication between different member states and businesses and CSOs to find and enable those with similar values and purposes to make that connection. You asked earlier, how can you lead with courage and what can we say to other businesses? Not every company is as big as Nestle, but may have just as valid and worthy and committed purposes and goals and values. How do you bring those people together so that perhaps as a group of companies with shared values, they can achieve a longer term goal, even if they're a small SME, for example?
Thank you. Kevin?
Well, sure. And having been working with the UNGC over the last few years and working on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Action Platform, had an occasion to think about this a bit. But I think what I would say is the UN is uniquely positioned as a conduit and convener between business, international institutions, and other stakeholders. And so the strength of that is to bring those parties together in a way that uses the star power of the UN system and its broad network, and create spaces where business can be utilized their strengths and expertise. The model in the past, by and large, was that the UN system looked for business for its financial resources, which are necessary, but frankly, not enough, and underutilizing the value that business can bring around its innovative resources, its technical expertise, and its broad logistical expertise, and a whole range of other things that business can bring to the piece to resolve issues. And so it's the UN system being somewhat more courageous, quite frankly, business being more courageous to engage. And then, collectively, I don't want to let governments off the hook here, quite frankly, because, one of the key issues, so it's been mentioned a few times, is around strengthening the rule of law. And as a precursor to the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2016, the then UN Secretary General acknowledged that the rule of law was a key pillar to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And so the strengthening of the rule of law, so that to create environments where it's not just about business having a secure place to do business and understanding the rules, but it's also about ensuring that individuals' human rights are protected and there's place and the system of justice works for all. And so that's a key, from my perspective, to put my lawyer's hat back on, in terms of the strengthening the rule of law. They have a leadership role there, and doing so, being somewhat tougher on governments where it's weak governance zones.
Okay.
So, yeah. And so,
I think that's, I want to leave the last couple minutes for Alan also, and I thank you for those comments. I think they're all valuable. Alan, you lead an initiative that is coming forward with a lot of very specific things business can do. I wonder if there's room for collaboration and sharing, and what your view is of what the UN can do, since you're the one person in the group anyway hasn't been as involved in the formation.
Yeah, look, I agree with everything that Leanne and Kevin have said. I think that setting the goals, the SDGs, is really important. I think providing the data to track progress against those is really important. Marjorie, your point about cooperation is critical. The scale of the problems we face, whether it's climate change or a global pandemic or workforce opportunity in a technology-driven, rapidly changing world, those things all require cooperation across sectors. And then finally, the thing I would say is just a recognition of what the superpower of business is. And this would go back to Milton Friedman. I mean, he wasn't all wrong, right? The profit-making incentive has led many businesses to do amazing things. And there's sometimes a view in the NGO sector and at the UN and elsewhere that profit per se is bad. And what we're seeing now is how the pursuit of profit and the pursuit of purpose together can be a powerful, powerful mechanism for sustainably addressing some of the world's greatest problems. And I think the UN can do more to embrace that.
I think that whole idea of understanding these two things work side by side is essential to having sustainable solutions, because if we don't have the resources, we can't sustain the solutions. And if we don't have the will, we won't have the solutions. So, I think that's absolutely right. Well, I want to thank each of you. I think this has been inspirational. I hope the people who are watching come away with some specific things that they can do, and also with the motivation and the will to do them. So Leanne and Kevin and Alan, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we're turning to a wrap up with Dov Seidman. And Dov is the founder and chair of LRM and the Howe Institute for Society. I think the first time I ever heard the word courage and business used together came from Dov, who I've known for quite a while, and from his book, How. And he's going to walk us through a little bit his thoughts on what courageous leadership means and why we need more of it. And maybe give us some advice as global leaders navigating in the world, what we can do to encourage our own courage as well as that of others. So Dev, over to you.
Thank you, Marjorie. It was great to listen to you, Alan, Leanne, and Kevin. And it's a privilege to talk about leadership in front of so many great, courageous leaders around the world. Leadership is not about headlines. We all know what they are. We all know about the rise in nationalism, polarization, misinformation, corruption, civil unrest. Leadership is about trend lines and having the courage to pass judgment on the future. It's about thinking deeply about the forces that are driving the world to where it wants to go and where it ought to go, and having the humility and the philosophical insights about the human condition to get all of this right. Stepping back, unprecedented and unfamiliar forces are not only rapidly changing the world, but they are dramatically reshaping our world. Our world operates differently. Powerful technological, social, environmental, and economic forces have brought us closer together and rendered us interdependent. Very few people can affect so many others so far away in ways they couldn't before. People's plights, hopes, dreams, frustrations are experienced directly and viscerally in tiny screens in our hands. Increasingly, we are interdependent because we rise and fall together. The moral philosopher David Hume argued that the moral imagination diminishes with distance. In our reshaped world, we're in a no-distance world. So our moral imagination has exploded. More people on more days see issues through the lens of good and bad, right and wrong, fair, unfair, just and unjust. And they go online and they broadcast their views to be met with others broadcasting their views. Spheres of society, the economy, and our lives that were once maintained as separate are now fused. Everything is personal, everything is human. Social, religious, geopolitical, environmental, human, and ethical issues that were once outside the business agenda are now inescapably central to the business agenda. In the fused world, the business of business can no longer be just business. The business of business must be and is now society. The global pandemic has only accelerated and intensified and revealed and amplified these forces and how they work and how they reshape the world. A tiny invisible pathogen has created the greatest leadership stress test at all levels in all sectors of society. And why do I say that? Because what started as a health crisis rapidly became a humanitarian crisis, and then an economic crisis, and an unprecedented unemployment crisis, a global supply chain crisis, revealing that so many supply chains were built for speed and efficiency and not resiliency and integrity. And also a moral crisis, because it confronts us with vexing issues and painful and profound dilemmas, even between saving lives and livelihoods, and laying bare deep truths, pervasive injustices and inequalities, both historic and modern day. When all of these crises combust simultaneously, we have a crisis of leadership and a crisis of authority. When so many people are scared and vulnerable and suffering, they naturally look to those in charge. They look to authority. They look to those in charge of institutions for leadership, to CEOs, to school principals, commanders in chiefs, prime ministers, presidents, governors, mayors, and also parents. They expect truthful answers, wise guidance, courageous action, and hope. All of this brings us to the urgent global leadership imperative of the 21st century. We all understand that you can't run a world, you can't have order or proper governance without positions of formal authority. But what really makes a world work is when individuals with formal authority and positions of formal authority are occupied by leaders with moral authority. Formal authority, as we know, can be seized. It can be won in elections. It can be bestowed. It can be locked up by an entrepreneur with supermajority shares. Formal leaders are really good at telling people what hill to climb, and they're good at getting them to do the next thing right. Moral authority is earned by who you are and how you lead. Moral leaders enlist people in journeys worthy of their dedication and loyalty, and they inspire them not to do the next thing right, but rather the next right thing. Moral leadership and building moral authority is not about moralizing. And it's more than activism, even though it does involve taking important positions on important issues. Moral leadership is about the how. How you wield power, not over people, but through people. How you gain your authority, not by your title, but by your behavior. How you relate to others, not one way, but two way, not coercively or motivationally, carrots and sticks, but rather inspirationally. To do all of this and to do it at scale, moral leaders build moral frameworks of shared purpose, sustainable, not situational, but sustainable values and ethical principles. And armed with these frameworks, moral leaders have the courage and conviction to highlight important nuance, to bring historical perspective, and to openly wrestle and navigate the gray. They do this by asking the right questions. What injustices are systemic and which are not? What misconduct is because of culture or just a bad apple? They also do this by asking challenging questions. Darren Walker, for example, the president of the Ford Foundation, recently asked the powerful and privileged among us, not what will you give back, but rather, what will you give up? And by asking this question, he opened pathways to reimagining a better path and a better future. These qualities are so critical to a healthy society that the president of Ireland, Michael Higgins, gave a national address calling for students to study philosophy so they too can develop the skills to think critically and thoughtfully. Moral leaders understand that outrage can either inspire or repress change. So they refrain from going directly from outrage to immediate demands without first having the necessary conversation so communities can come together to achieve real and lasting progress. They refuse to rely solely on cost-benefit analysis thinking. They make their decisions based on principle, however inconvenient or even unpopular. This helps them avoid doing the right things for the wrong reasons because they know that that doesn't scale because it does not enter the heart. They have the courage to see what others view as weaknesses, as strengths, compassion, empathy, love, and humility. Like when Bill Gates, who warned early on about the potential pandemic, still said that he could have done more. There's also Dr. Fauci, who so often says he doesn't know, so that people tend to listen to him when he does know. Above all, moral leaders see the full humanity in others. They don't see X's and O's or human resources or just talent, but people. They don't see consumers, but citizens. In this spirit, moral leaders are thus on a transformational journey away from shareholder primacy conception of capitalism towards a stakeholder conception of capitalism. And that's because they don't see stakeholders as means to shareholder ends, but as equal constituents, as people with hopes, dreams, aspirations, and concerns. In closing, leaders who pass this great leadership stress test will be those who use the pandemic not just for admirable humanitarian assistance, but to strengthen or transform their organizations as fully human endeavors. They will put humanity at the center of all decisions and actions. In a post-pandemic world, moral leaders know that we will have been forever changed. Our expectations are forever going higher. In a post-pandemic world, they won't go back to selling. They will take the qualities they manifested in crisis, sacrifice, empathy, and compassion, and pivot away from saving towards serving. In this regard, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals taken as a whole serve as a powerful framework for what we need to do. And Goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, is the how. It's the how we will get there. But I'd like to say we must no longer see it as a goal. Goal 16 cannot be a goal. It has to be our urgent imperative. It animates everything else. Finally, moral leaders understand that the true antidote to fear in times that cause us so much fear is hope, not optimism. Moral leaders are purveyors of hope. They help us see hope even in the struggle. And with hope, we see possibility for a reimagined and better future. My greatest hope is that not too far in the future, this form of moral leadership will no longer require courage because it will be everywhere. It will occupy countless spheres and countless realms of both business and society. Thank you for the opportunity to address you.
Thank you, Dov. Thank you, Marjorie, for a really insightful discussion. If you're just joining us, welcome to Uniting Business Live and the UN Private Sector Forum. I'm Tolu Olubumi, your host and guide. You can follow all of the chats right here on the platform, as well as on social media using the hashtag Uniting Business. For the first time in its 75-year history, this year's UN General Assembly is happening virtually and almost entirely online. But although that means that we cannot invite you to be here in New York with us in person, it doesn't stop us from bringing it to you right here on Uniting Business Live. So now we are going to go live to the UN General Assembly for the opening session of the high-level meeting to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations and the presentation by the Secretary General of a forward-looking report, The Future We Want, United Nations, the United Nations we need, reaffirming our collective commitment to multilateralism.